It all imploded over Sunday lunch. The sound in the restaurant was a polite murmur, the gentle chime of forks on plates. But to me, it always sounded staged, like a soundtrack for a life I wasn't really living. We were at the Crystal Vine, my father's go-to spot for family gatherings. It was a place of dark wood, crisp white linens, and waiters who glided between tables with unnerving silence. It was the kind of restaurant that made me hyper-aware of my own presence, feeling like I had tracked dirt onto their pristine floors, even though my shoes were probably the most well-kept thing I owned. I was wedged between my mother, who was delicately blotting her lipstick on a napkin, and my younger sister, Sophia, who was completely absorbed by the glowing screen of her phone. Across from me, my father, Richard, was in his element, spinning a tale about a recent fishing trip into an epic saga. He had a gift for that, making his mundane weekends sound like heroic adventures. He was the star of our little solar system, and the rest of us were just planets, expected to orbit him quietly and admire his light. But before we get into the full story, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. My grandfather, Henry, sat at the head of the table. He was the true center of gravity in our family, though he never demanded the spotlight. At 83, his eyes were still sharp, and his smile was the only one that didn't feel like a performance. He'd made the 3-hour drive just for his monthly visit, and having him there was like wrapping a warm blanket around myself in a freezing room. I was idly stirring my iced tea with a straw, pretending to be captivated by my father's story, when Grandpa Henry lifted his glass. The light caught the crystal, scattering a tiny rainbow over the white tablecloth. "A toast," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that instantly cut through the room's sterile atmosphere. Everyone went quiet. My father paused his story, a brief flash of irritation crossing his face at being upstaged, but he quickly masked it with a tolerant smile. Grandpa's eyes met mine from across the table. They held a look of pure, uncomplicated pride, something I so rarely received from anyone else. "To Maya," he announced. "I was just thinking on my drive down here how incredibly proud I am of her, building a life for herself, standing on her own 2 feet." He was beaming, and I felt that familiar, uncomfortable heat rise in my cheeks. I was never good at accepting compliments. They always felt like a prelude to failure. Then, he delivered the words that brought the entire performance to a screeching halt. "And I'm so happy you love the apartment I bought for you, sweetheart." My hand, holding a glass of water halfway to my lips, just stopped. The motion was so sudden that a few drops spilled over the edge, cold against my skin. The sound of my father's voice was gone. The ambient chatter from other tables seemed to recede into a far-off buzz. The entire world, it seemed, had fallen perfectly, horribly silent. I watched, as if in slow motion, as my mother's hand froze on its way to her teacup. Her perfectly applied lipstick seemed to quiver. Beside me, Sophia's thumb paused its endless, mindless scrolling. Even she, sealed in her bubble of digital apathy, had felt the sudden drop in pressure. Then came the loudest sound I'd ever heard. My father's heavy silver fork slipped from his grasp and clattered onto his plate. It was a sharp, metallic crack, like a gunshot in a cathedral. I slowly lowered my glass back to the table, my hand trembling so slightly I prayed no one could see. My throat felt impossibly tight. I looked at my grandfather, whose smile was still fixed in place, completely oblivious to the grenade he had just rolled onto the table. "What apartment?" I whispered. The words were so faint, I wasn't sure I'd actually said them. But they heard. Everyone heard. Grandpa Henry blinked, his smile finally wavering as confusion clouded his features. He tilted his head. The apartment, honey, the one I paid for, that condo downtown right after you graduated, your graduation gift. My stomach didn't just drop. It felt like it was violently ripped out, leaving behind a cold, cavernous void. The condo downtown, my graduation gift. The words were alien. They belonged to a different story, a different life. A life where a grandfather buys his granddaughter a home and she actually gets to live in it. For the last 4 years, my life had been the polar opposite of a downtown condo. My life was a basement, a damp, musty room in the back of a house owned by a woman named Mrs. Petrova, whose constant smoking left a smell that permeated the floorboards and clung to my hair and clothes. My life was handing her $600 in cash every single month because she distrusted the banking system. My life was the constant groaning shudder of the boiler, which served as my only roommate. My life was a collection of furniture scavenged from thrift stores and a mattress I'd found on the side of the road. It was the perpetual feeling of being underground, both literally and metaphorically. And in that one awful, clarifying moment, the two realities smashed into each other. The life my grandfather had intended for me, and the life I was actually living. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The money, the apartment he had bought, all the lectures from my father about being responsible, about how he and my mother couldn't afford to be my safety net, about how I had to learn the value of hard work by earning every last penny myself. The way he'd look at me with that strange, disappointed pride whenever I mentioned picking up an extra shift. "That's my girl," he'd say, making her own way. The truth didn't land with a thunderclap. It was a silent, suffocating tsunami that washed over our fake family lunch and drowned everything in its path. My gaze slowly drifted from my grandfather's bewildered face to my father's. His skin was pale and waxy. He refused to look at me. He was staring at his plate, at the fork he'd dropped, as if it held all the secrets of the universe. He had taken it. He had taken the money that was meant for my future, for my home, for my start. He had taken it and let me drown. He had watched me work until my bones ached with exhaustion, day in and day out, for years, all while knowing he held the key to my freedom. And no one had said a thing. The lie was his, but the silence belonged to all of them. Everyone at this table had known or suspected, or at the very least, made a conscious choice to look away. But now, the question was out in the open. The illusion was shattered, and the silence was finally and irrevocably broken. My name is Maya Evans. I'm 28, but most days I feel a solid 45. The exhaustion I carry isn't the kind you can sleep off. It's the deep, chronic ache of having to claw and fight for things that should be given, like basic support, or at the very least, a little honesty. When I graduated from college with a degree in interior design, I was like any other new grad, full of hope, terrified, and completely broke. I had a portfolio filled with sketches and big ideas, but my bank account was a wasteland. I moved back home for about a month, back into my childhood bedroom, but the air in that house was thick with tension. My father made it abundantly clear that this was a temporary courtesy. "The real world is calling, Maya," he would say over dinner, his tone not exactly cruel but firm with an unyielding pressure. "You need to learn what responsibility means. Your mother and I aren't a fallback plan," and I believed him. He was my father. His words were the bedrock of my world. So I packed my 2 suitcases and found the cheapest living situation I could, which turned out to be the basement room at Mrs. Petrova's house. The first few months were brutal. I sent out dozens of applications to design firms and received nothing but automated rejections. The industry was cutthroat, and I lacked the connections and the breezy confidence of the other applicants. My portfolio felt inadequate, my dreams flimsy. So, I did what I had to. I took a job cleaning offices from 5 a.m. to noon. It was solitary, anonymous work. I'd scrub toilets and empty trash cans in gleaming corporate towers where people with lives I couldn't even fathom would arrive just as I was leaving, reeking of bleach and defeat. I'd see the photos of their families on their desks and feel a sharp pang of something I couldn't quite name. In the afternoons, I'd take the bus back to my basement, shower, and try to sleep for a couple of hours before my second job. I was a waitress at a 24-hour place called the Daily Grind Diner. I spent my nights refilling coffee cups, forcing smiles for rude customers, and fighting the searing pain in my feet. I'd get home after midnight, my clothes smelling of old grease and my pockets heavy with a handful of tips that would just barely cover my groceries for the week. I kept telling myself it was a phase, a character-building exercise. I was paying my dues, as my dad so often put it. I remember one night, about a year into this routine, I called him. I was sitting on the edge of my lumpy mattress, listening to the boiler roar to life. I was so bone-tired I could feel the exhaustion as a physical pressure behind my eyes. My first student loan bill had just arrived, and the number on it made me feel physically ill. "Dad?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from cracking. I was just wondering. "Do you know anyone hiring, even for an unpaid internship? I'll do anything. I just feel like I'm falling so far behind." There was a long pause on his end. I could hear the murmur of the television in the background, the ambient sounds of his comfortable, easy life. "Maya, we've had this conversation," he said, his voice laced with that familiar, patient disappointment. "Nobody is going to hand you success. You have to earn it. If you're not making enough, get a third job. Work at a fast food place. It builds character." I mumbled a quiet okay and hung up the phone. I didn't cry. Crying didn't pay the rent. I just sat there in the dark, feeling the vast, unbridgeable chasm between his world and mine. He wasn't just refusing to help, he was framing my struggle as a necessary part of my moral education, a lesson I was required to learn. My mother was a ghost in these interactions. Whenever I mentioned my difficulties, a pained expression would cross her face, and she'd suddenly find something urgent to attend to in another room. Her silence was its own form of communication. It said, "Don't push, don't make things difficult. Your father knows what's best." It was a quiet, constant betrayal that hurt in a way all its own. The pain of being unseen by the one person who is supposed to see you above all others. And my sister Sophia might as well have been living on another planet. She had breezed through college on a current of our parents' money and approval. The year after I graduated, she got her own degree, and my dad co-signed a lease for a gorgeous apartment in the trendiest part of town and bought her a new car as a well-done. When I tried to explain to her once how hard things were for me, how I was just barely getting by, she just rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Maya, you're so dramatic," she'd said, texting while she spoke. "It's not that hard, just like make a budget or something." So I learned to get by on my own. I became an expert in instant noodles and thrift store finds. I learned that loneliness is a physical presence, a cold spot in the bed beside you. I stopped talking about my jobs, my basement, my exhaustion. I built a wall around my life and presented a curated version of myself at family functions, a version that was fine, just fine. Because anything else was a complaint, a weakness, a source of drama. I learned to exist in the silence they had built for me. For 4 years, that was my normal. That was the reality I accepted. I accepted that I was the forgotten one, the one who had to struggle, the one who wasn't worthy of the help my sister got so effortlessly. I had internalized their story. Sophia was the success, and I was the cautionary tale. So when my grandfather said those words, "The apartment I bought for you," it didn't just shatter the silence at the lunch table. It shattered the very foundation of my identity. Every lecture about responsibility, every dismissive eye roll from my sister, every time my mother looked away, it all replayed in my mind. But this time, it was all twisted, warped into something monstrous. My struggle wasn't a necessary lesson. It was a deliberate, cruel, and calculated lie orchestrated by my own father. He hadn't been building my character. He had been funding his own life with the gift that was meant to start mine, and the family I had tried so desperately to please had been his silent accomplices. The floor beneath my feet was gone, and I was in a free fall. The silence that followed my whispered question, "What apartment?" was heavy and suffocating like a wet wool blanket. For a beat, no one moved. We were a still life portrait of a family imploding. My grandfather was the first to speak, his voice stripped of its earlier warmth, now edged with deep confusion. He looked from my pale face to my father's rigid posture. "The condo, Richard," Grandpa said, his words aimed directly at my dad. "The one at Oakwood Towers. I bought it for Maya. You handled all the paperwork. You told me she moved in right after graduation and absolutely loved it." Every head at the table swiveled to face my father. He still wouldn't look up from his plate, studying the floral pattern on the china as if it were a complex work of art. My mother's hand, which had been frozen by her teacup, began to tremble. She quickly hid it in her lap. "Richard," she said, her voice thin and reedy, a sound I hadn't heard from her in years. "What is he talking about?" My father finally raised his head. His face was a chaotic mix of shock, fear, and a bizarre flash of anger, as if we were the ones in the wrong for unearthing his secret. He cleared his throat, trying to wrap himself in the cloak of authority he always wore. "It was an investment, Henry," he said, attempting a casual tone that failed spectacularly. "The market wasn't right. I was holding on to it for her. I was going to deal with it later." The lie was so flimsy, so insulting in its simplicity, that something inside me finally snapped. 4 years of quiet compliance, of biting my tongue, of swallowing my hurt, it all dissolved in a rush of pure, cold fury. "No," I said. My voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air. It sounded louder than I'd intended, stronger. "You weren't going to deal with it later. You were going to keep it." Every gaze that had been fixed on my father now turned to me. I could feel their shock. I was Maya, the quiet one, the one who never made waves. But the woman who had just spoken wasn't her. She was someone new, forged in the fire of this betrayal. My grandfather's expression hardened. The gentle confusion was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. He stared at my father, his son, and I saw the exact moment his trust in him disintegrated. "I wired that money directly to you, Richard," Grandpa said, his voice low and dangerous. $85,000. The transfer memo explicitly stated its purpose: for Maya's condo purchase. $85,000. The number hung in the air, obscene and impossible. My mind raced doing the math. That was more money than I had earned in the last 4 years combined. Enough for a down payment on a home. Enough for a life free from the constant, crushing weight of financial anxiety. Enough for a future. My voice dropped to a whisper again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from the sheer, crushing weight of his cruelty. I looked at my father, who was finally looking at me, his eyes pleading for a silence I was no longer capable of giving. "He told me to work harder," I said, my voice trembling with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing me apart. "He told me to get a third job. He told me I was on my own." I took a shaky breath. All that time, he was sitting on my future. He pocketed my future. For the first time in my life, my father looked small. The confidence, the authority, the self-righteousness, it had all evaporated. He was just a man, stripped bare by his own greed. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What was there to say? The truth was laid out on the white tablecloth between us, more damning than any accusation. I couldn't sit there a second longer. I couldn't breathe that poisoned air. I shoved my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. The sound was jarring and violent. It felt right. I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady. I looked down at my father, at this stranger who had raised me. "You always told me that hardship builds character," I said, my voice even and clear. "I guess I finally have some." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, a physical weight on my back. I walked past the other tables of happy families enjoying their Sunday lunches, and I felt nothing. I was numb, hollowed out. But for the first time in a very long time, I also felt free. I walked out of the restaurant, out of the lie, and into the cold, clean air of the truth. The air outside was cold, a sharp contrast to my hot cheeks. It was a typical gray November day, the kind that threatens rain but never delivers. I stood on the pavement of the parking lot, wrapping my arms around myself, though the chill I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was a cold that radiated from the inside out, a deep, cellular shock. Through the large plate glass window of the restaurant, I could see them, a frozen tableau at the table, their faces a mixture of horror and confusion. I just needed to breathe, to take in air that wasn't thick with lies. I leaned against a parked car, the cold metal a small, grounding sensation. Where was I supposed to go from here? What was I supposed to do? My entire past now felt like a fabrication, and my future was a terrifyingly blank map. The basement that had been my private world of struggle now felt like a prison cell my own father had built for me. Then I heard the restaurant door swing open, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on the asphalt. I tensed, bracing for a confrontation I didn't have the energy for. I assumed it was my father coming to spin another lie, or my mother coming to plead for peace, for me to just let it go. "Maya, wait." The voice was strained and tired, but it was my grandfather's. I turned as he caught up to me, his hand gently resting on my arm. He was out of breath, and his face, usually so full of life, looked pale and sunken. His eyes were wet. "You really," he started, then paused to catch his breath. "You really never got the apartment?" The question was so simple, so full of a pain that mirrored my own. All I could do was shake my head. Words felt too big, too difficult. "I live in a basement," I finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash. "My roommate is a boiler." The expression that washed over his face is something I will never forget. It was like he'd been physically struck. The last bit of color drained from his skin. He looked past me toward the anonymous city skyline, as if he could see the last 4 years of my life playing out in the gray clouds. "Your father," he said, his voice raspy with disbelief. "He told me you refused my help. He said you were fiercely independent and wanted to make it entirely on your own. He made it sound so noble." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Independent? Grandpa, I was desperate. I asked him for a job lead once, just a lead. I told him I'd sweep floors if it meant getting a foot in the door." "What did he say?" Grandpa Henry asked, his eyes locking onto mine, demanding the truth. "He told me to go get a job flipping burgers," I said flatly. "He said it would be good for me, teach me humility. My grandfather's face, which had been filled with sorrow, began to darken with a slow burning rage. It was an anger I had never seen in him, and it was terrifying and, in a strange way, deeply comforting. It was an anger on my behalf. "He told me you were ungrateful," Grandpa whispered, as if confessing a sin. "He said he and your mother offered you everything, but you threw it back in their faces. He said you were difficult, that you never appreciated what you had." Those words were like slaps. Ungrateful, difficult. For years, I had secretly wondered if they were true. I had spent countless nights in my basement, wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't be more like Sophia, why I felt so disconnected from my own family. I had blamed myself. Now I knew. It was all part of the narrative he'd constructed to hide his crime. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my reputation, rewriting me as the villain in a story where he was the patient, long-suffering father. I looked my grandfather straight in the eye, the numbness inside me finally giving way to a clean, sharp rage. "I didn't know I was supposed to thank him for theft," I said. My grandfather's jaw tightened. He pulled his hand away from my arm and clenched it into a fist. He looked back at the restaurant, at the son he had raised. The son who had lied to him, stolen from him, and used his generosity as a weapon against his own child. "This is not just about the money, Maya," he said, his voice low and steady. "He lied to me. He used my love for you to hurt you. That I cannot forgive." In that moment, standing in that cold, impersonal parking lot, I felt a bond with my grandfather I had never felt before. We were two people on an island, the last survivors of a shipwreck we hadn't seen coming. We were the ones who had been betrayed. We were a team. The anger was still there, a hot coil in my stomach, but for the first time I wasn't alone in it. I had an ally, and he was just as furious as I was. My grandfather stood in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the restaurant window where the remnants of our family were still trapped in the wreckage. The anger on his face slowly morphed into a look of grim determination. "I am going to fix this," he said quietly, turning back to me. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. I crossed my arms over my chest, a defensive posture I'd perfected over the years. "How?" I asked, the word coming out more broken than I intended. How could he fix 4 years of lies? How could he give me back the time I'd lost, the opportunities I'd missed, the belief in my own family that had been utterly destroyed? He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy promises. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and said 4 simple words: "Show me your place." The request caught me off guard. A wave of shame washed over me. My basement wasn't a place you showed people. It was a secret, a symbol of my failure. But looking at my grandfather's face, I saw no judgment, only a deep, resonant need to understand the full scope of the betrayal. "Okay," I whispered. That night, after a tense and mostly silent drive back from the city, I drove him there. My old beat-up car rattled down the streets of my neighborhood, a part of town with cracked sidewalks and houses that looked as weary as I felt. When I pulled up to Mrs. Petrova's house, it was already dark. The porch light was out, as usual. "This is it," I said, trying for a casual tone. He got out of the car and stared at the house, then at the narrow, crumbling concrete steps that led down the side of the building to a separate entrance below ground. He didn't say a word, just followed me down. I unlocked the door and flipped a switch. A single bare bulb flickered on, casting a weak yellow light over the room. "Welcome to my palace," I said, the bitter irony hanging heavy in the air. He stepped inside, and his presence seemed to shrink the already tiny space. He stood in the middle of the room on the worn linoleum and slowly took it all in. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the faint rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the walls. I saw the room through his eyes, the sagging ceiling stained with water spots from the bathroom above, the sickly yellow walls, discolored from years of Mrs. Petrova's smoke seeping through the floorboards, my lumpy mattress on a simple metal frame pushed against the wall right next to the hulking, groaning boiler. There was no real kitchen, just a hot plate and a microwave on a rickety card table. There were no windows. He walked over to the wall that separated my room from the boiler room and placed a hand on it. He could feel the faint vibration, the low rumble that was the constant soundtrack to my life. He looked at the small, wobbly desk where I used to spread out my design portfolio, trying to dream in a place that felt utterly devoid of hope. He had imagined me in a bright, sunny condo with a view. He had pictured me safe and secure, and all the while I was here, in the dark, underground. He turned to face me, his expression a mask of grief and fury. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a terrible crime scene. In a way, he had. Then he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the boiler. He didn't just steal from you, Maya. He stole from both of us. I could only nod, a knot of unshed tears forming in my throat. In those words, I found a validation that was more powerful than any apology could ever be. He wasn't just my grandfather. He was my fellow victim. He had been robbed of the joy of providing for his granddaughter, robbed of the truth, robbed of his trust in his own son. He stood there for another minute, his jaw set like stone. The gentle, smiling man from the lunch table was gone. In his place was someone I had never seen before, a man ready for war. Tomorrow, he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a low, steely command. We're going to the bank. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a promise that the hiding was over, the lies were over, the silence was over. Tomorrow, we were going to find the truth in black and white, and we were going to use it to take back everything my father had stolen. I barely slept that night. My grandfather had insisted I stay with him in the guest room of his quiet, comfortable house, a place I hadn't visited in over a year. The sheets were crisp and smelled of lavender, a jarring contrast to the perpetual scent of damp and smoke that clung to everything I owned. But comfort felt alien, and sleep was a country I couldn't find my way back to. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over. My father's ashen face, my mother's trembling hand, the clatter of the fork. It was a film stuck on a loop, each viewing more painful than the last. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I came downstairs to find my grandfather already in the kitchen, a cup of black coffee in his hand, staring out the window. He wasn't in his usual retirement khakis. He was wearing a suit, the kind he used to wear when he ran his construction company. It was his armor. He heard me enter and turned, his eyes clear and resolved. The grief from the day before had been burned away, leaving something harder in its place. "Good morning, Maya," he said, his voice all business. "Coffee's on the counter." Before I could even take a sip, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. There were no pleasantries. Davison. "It's Henry Evans," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "I need you at the main branch in an hour, and I need you to find a transaction record for me, a wire transfer from my personal account to my son, Richard Evans, from approximately 4 years ago. The amount was $85,000. Find the transfer and find out where every cent of it went." He listened for a moment, then said, "I don't care what you have to move. We will be there at 9 a.m. "Thank you, Mr. Davison." He hung up and looked at me. "Get dressed," he said. "Wear something that makes you feel strong." By 9 o'clock, we were sitting in a large, intimidating office at the downtown branch of his bank. It was an old building with marble floors and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb all sound. It felt like a temple dedicated to facts, a place where numbers couldn't lie. The banker, a man named Davison with kind eyes and a serious suit, greeted my grandfather with a respectful handshake. He led us to a conference room where a computer monitor sat on a long, polished table. "I found it, Henry," Mr. Davison said quietly, sitting behind the keyboard. It wasn't hard. He typed for a moment, and the screen flickered to life. And there it was, a line of stark, undeniable text. Date, June 12, 2020. Transfer from Henry T. Evans. Transfer to Richard J. Evans. Amount $85,000. Memo for Maya's condo purchase. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my chest. Seeing it there, in official impersonal text, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was a crime with a paper trail. My grandfather had done exactly what he'd said. He had tried to give me a home. Mr. Davison's fingers tapped the keyboard again. "That's the incoming transfer to your son's account," he explained, his voice neutral. "And this is what happened next." Another screen appeared, a statement from my father's account. My eyes scanned the lines of debits and credits, my heart pounding in my ears, and then I saw it. Date, June 17, 2020. Transfer to Apex Private Investment Account 774B. Amount $85,000. Memo, initial investment, 5 days. It had taken him only 5 days. 5 days from receiving a gift meant for his daughter to rerouting it into a private investment account under his name. There was no mention of me, no indication that it was being held in trust. It was just gone, absorbed into his own finances as if it had always belonged to him. The speed of it was what struck me most. No hesitation, no crisis of conscience, just a clean, efficient theft. A wave of nausea rolled over me. All those times I'd been short on rent, all those nights I had eaten instant noodles, all those extra shifts I had picked up when my body was screaming for rest. All of it had been happening while my money, my future, was sitting in an account growing for him. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen, his jaw so tight I could see the muscles working in his cheek. He had the look of a builder who had just discovered a fatal flaw in the foundation of a building he had constructed with his own hands. His son, his foundation. It was rotten. When the banker turned to look at us, my grandfather's voice was as cold and hard as the marble floor outside. "Print every page, Davison. I want a certified copy of every single transaction." Davison nodded, quietly tapping a few more keys before the printer in the corner whirred to life. He excused himself from the room, leaving us alone with the silent, damning evidence on the screen. My grandfather finally turned to me, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond anger. "He didn't just steal your money, Maya," he said, his voice soft now and full of a terrible sadness. "He stole my trust, the trust a father is supposed to have in his son." I looked from his heartbroken face to the screen, where the story of the last 4 years was told in 2 simple lines of text. The hollow feeling in my stomach was beginning to be replaced by something else, a cold, hard resolve. I was done being sad. I was done feeling like a victim. It was time to fight back. I met his eyes. "Then let's take it back." The printer finished its work, and a neat stack of paper slid into the tray. It was our ammunition, the truth, in black and white. The drive to my parents' house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the passenger seat of my grandfather's big, quiet car, the stack of certified bank statements resting on my lap. The papers felt dense with the weight of the truth they contained. Neither of us spoke. We were a two-person army on our way to the front lines, and the battlefield was the beige suburban house I had grown up in. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw Sophia's new shiny SUV parked near the garage. A fresh wave of anger washed over me. The car my parents had helped her buy, the easy life they had provided for her, likely funded in part by the money that should have been mine. My grandfather put the car in park and turned to me. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I nodded, clutching the papers. "I'm ready." We walked up the familiar stone path to the front door. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. Before we could ring the bell, the door opened. It was my mother, on her way out to water her porch ferns. She froze when she saw us, the automatic smile on her face dissolving into a look of startled panic. "Henry, Maya," she stammered, her eyes darting between my grandfather's grim expression and the file in my hands. We weren't expecting you." Just then, my father appeared in the doorway behind her. He was dressed in golf clothes, looking annoyed. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. "We need to talk, Richard," my grandfather said, his voice calm but with an underlying tone of steel that stopped my father cold. My dad tried to wave it away. "Now's not a good time." I was just heading out. He tried a weak, dismissive smile. "Whatever this is, it can wait." My grandfather took a step forward, his presence seeming to fill the entire doorway. He looked his son dead in the eye, and the force of his gaze was immense. He said 2 words, and in those 2 words, the power dynamic of our entire family shifted forever. "Sit down." It was not a request. It was an order. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father obey without question. The bravado, the arrogance, it all fell away. He looked like a chastened child. He backed away from the door, and we followed him inside into the formal dining room, the one reserved for holidays. The long, polished mahogany table reflected our tense faces like a dark mirror. "Sit," my grandfather said again. My father sat. My mother hovered nervously by the door before sinking into a chair at the far end. My grandfather and I took seats directly across from my dad. Without a word, my grandfather placed the stack of papers on the table, right in front of my father. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. "These are bank records, Richard," my grandfather began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Certified. They show a transfer of $85,000 from my account to yours, for the express purpose of buying your daughter a home." My father stared at the papers, his face ashen. "And they show another transfer," my grandfather continued, his voice hardening 5 days later, "of that exact amount into your personal investment account. You took the money meant for your daughter. You lied to her. You lied to me." My dad stammered, I was saving it for her future. It was an investment, for her." The excuse was so pathetic that my grandfather snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "She's been living in a basement." The words echoed in the silent room. My mother let out a small, strangled sob. My father flinched, and that's when I knew it was my turn. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, cold calm. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke directly to him, my voice steady and clear. "You told me I wasn't working hard enough," I said. "You told me I didn't deserve help. You told me to flip burgers. You watched me work 2 jobs for 4 years and told me you were proud of my character." Was this part of the lesson, Dad? Was watching me suffer while you gambled with my future supposed to make me a better person? The truth, spoken plainly, hit him harder than any slap could. He sagged in his chair, his defenses crumbling to dust. He had no words, no excuses, no lies left. There was only the ugly, undeniable truth sitting on the table between us. The silence that followed my question was absolute. My father stared at the polished surface of the dining room table, his reflection a distorted, broken version of the man he pretended to be. My mother's quiet sobs were the only sound, each one a small punctuation mark in our family's collapse. My grandfather let the silence hang in the air, then reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out another document. He opened a single, folded sheet of thick, cream-colored paper and slid it across the table to my father. It was a formal letter on a lawyer's letterhead. "That is your future, Richard," my grandfather said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Read it." My father's hand trembled as he reached for the letter. His eyes scanned the page, his face growing paler with every word. I couldn't see what it said, but I could see its effect. It was the look of a man watching the bars of his cage close around him. "You have two choices," my grandfather explained, his voice cold and methodical. "Choice one is that I take this file," he tapped the bank statements, "to the district attorney, and I press charges for fraud and theft. You will be arrested. You will lose your job, your reputation, and very likely your freedom. I will testify against you. Maya will testify against you." He paused, letting the severity sink in. "Or," he continued, "you can accept the terms in that letter. There will be no negotiation. This is the only path forward that does not end in your complete ruin." My father's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "What does it say?" my mother whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. My grandfather looked at her, his expression softening for a moment into one of deep disappointment. "It says that Richard will pay back every dollar, the full $85,000 plus 4 years of compound interest, to be calculated by my accountant. He will liquidate whatever assets are necessary. The money will be transferred into a trust for Maya within 6 months." He wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, his gaze returning to my father, "he will sign the confession attached to that letter, and next week he will read it aloud to the entire family, to your sister, your cousins, everyone. They all deserve to know the kind of man you are." It was brutal, a systematic dismantling of my father's pride. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about forcing him to own the truth, to speak it in his own voice. "Richard, tell me it isn't true," my mother whispered, her eyes pleading. My father just stared at the letter, his face a mask of utter defeat. His silence was her answer. The last flicker of hope in her eyes died. With the business concluded, my grandfather's attention turned to me. The hardness left his face, replaced by a gentle concern. "Maya," he said softly, "you're not staying in that basement another night. Go upstairs to your old room and pack a bag. You're moving in with me until we find you a new place, a proper place." The offer was a lifeline. It was safety, it was care, offered freely and without condition. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back finally welled in my eyes. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I whispered. I looked at my father, this small, broken man, and for the first time I didn't feel small or inadequate. I felt nothing for him at all. The power he had held over me for so long had been built on lies, and now that the lies were gone, so was his power. The following Sunday felt like a dream. We returned to the Crystal Vine, the scene of the crime. My grandfather had insisted. "The truth needs to happen in the same place as the lie," he'd said. But this time, everything was different. When we arrived, my grandfather led me to the head of the table, pulling out the chair for me. He took the seat to my right. We were the new heads of the family. As the rest of the family trickled in, my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, they sensed the tension, greeting us with nervous smiles. My mother and Sophia came in together. Mom looked like she had aged 10 years in a week. Sophia just looked bewildered. Finally, my father walked in. He stopped dead when he saw me and my grandfather at the head of the table. He walked to his seat like a man walking to the gallows. Once everyone was settled, my grandfather stood up. His gravity commanded the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I have something to say. 4 years ago, I gave my son, Richard, a substantial amount of money. It was a gift for his daughter, Maya, to buy her an apartment. A murmur went through the family. My son," my grandfather continued, his gaze fixed on my father, "did not give Maya the money. He took it for himself. He lied to me, telling me she was living in a beautiful condo. He lied to Maya, telling her she was on her own, and he let her suffer, working 2 jobs and living in a basement while he pretended to be a noble father." A collective gasp went through the table. Sophia stared at me, her mouth hanging open. For the first time, she was seeing my life hadn't been a drama. It had been a struggle she couldn't imagine. My grandfather reached into his pocket and pulled out the confession. He walked around the table and placed it in front of my father. "Read it," he commanded. My father picked up the paper, his hands shaking violently. The entire restaurant was silent, watching. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice a hoarse, shaking whisper. "I, Richard Evans," he began, "admit that on June 12, 2020, I misappropriated $85,000 given to me in trust by my father, Henry Evans. This money was intended for my daughter, Maya Evans." He had to stop, taking a shaky breath. "I intentionally deceived my father. I intentionally deceived my daughter, Maya. I allowed her to struggle financially for 4 years while I used her money for my own personal gain." He read the entire thing, every self-incriminating word. By the time he finished, his face was wet with tears of shame. He dropped the paper on the table as if it had burned him. When he finished, there was a profound, ringing silence. It was the sound of a family finally seeing itself clearly. The masks were off, and in the wreckage, for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet change. True to his word, my grandfather helped me find a new place. It was a sunny 1-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a building downtown, with real windows that overlooked a small park. After 4 years of living underground, the sunlight felt like a miracle. The first morning I woke up there, I lay in bed and just watched the light stream through the window. There was no smell of mold, no sound of a groaning boiler. It was a home. That morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my old laptop, found the file labeled Portfolio, and blew off the digital dust. I spent the next week updating it, feeling a spark of the passion I thought had died. I was no longer just a survivor, I was a designer again. I started applying to every interior design studio in the city. 3 months after that terrible Sunday lunch, I landed a job. It was a junior designer position at a small boutique firm that specialized in small apartments, the very kind of space I once dreamed of having. My past, once a source of shame, was now my strength. I knew what it felt like to live in a soul-crushing space, and I knew how to turn it into a sanctuary. A few weeks later, I hosted my first brunch. Just me and my grandfather, at a small table I had thrifted and repainted by the window in my new apartment. He looked around, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. He raised his coffee cup in a toast. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what I imagined." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Me too, Grandpa," I said. "Me too." We sat there in the quiet, sunny room, two survivors who had rebuilt something beautiful from the rubble. My story has a happy ending, but the scars are still there. My relationship with my parents is broken, perhaps irreparably. My father is paying back the money, but he can never pay back the time. My mother and sister call sometimes, their voices filled with a hesitant, guilty kindness I don't yet know how to accept. Healing isn't a straight line, but my experience taught me that secrets and lies can rot a family from the inside out. But the truth, no matter how painful, is like sunlight. It's a disinfectant. It's the only thing that allows for new growth. If you've ever been betrayed by your own family, if you've ever been made to feel small or invisible by the people who are supposed to love you most, remember this: your truth has power. Speaking it is the first step toward reclaiming your life. Truth can rebuild what lies destroy. Like, comment, and subscribe, because sometimes the best revenge is finally coming home.